one slide on that, but I also realized that all of you were getting your beauty sleep when I gave the global learning session on carbon markets last week, because it was in the morning, European time. So a little bit around those slides that I presented, and it could be also a learning opportunity. Does that sound okay?
Yes. Okay. Actually, the presentation last week was not fully through, huh?
Yeah, that's true. So I think we won't have enough time to go through all of the slides, because last week we talked for an hour, including questions, and we never got to aviation, and also we never got to voluntary markets. So we might have a global learning session on those later on this summer. So Sarah, just before I get started, we scheduled 30 minutes for this. Is that still the time you want to use?
Yeah, that's the idea. Maybe we go, let's say 10, max 15 minutes over these questions.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
So then I think what I'll do is I'll just go through the practice, and then I'll go through a little bit around carbon markets versus carbon taxes, because I thought this was a very appropriate thing to discuss in Latin America, considering what's happening in the region. And then I'll probably just touch on sort of what's happening worldwide with carbon pricing. And why don't I'll stop at the end of each slide and I'll answer any questions. Okay, so this is just the one slide I prepared on the practice. When I prepared it, I realized Climate and Carbon Practice stands for CCP, which is very funny to me because that's the Chinese Communist Party. But that's not what we're talking about today. And this practice is entirely focused on policy advisory for climate and carbon. And examples of the work we do is on certificates. So we're doing advisory work on carbon markets. Right now, we have a huge mandate with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in North Africa on helping those countries set up carbon markets. We're doing work with the Climate Cent Foundation on developing Article 6 carbon market pilot in Thailand. We're also doing work on carbon taxes with offsets. So we're trying to do work on this topic potentially with the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. And then we also have some work around renewable energy certificates, which Miguel was recently working on together with an organization called Carbon Limits in Argentina. So the real idea with the certificates consultancy-based work is that we provide both downstream and upstream policy advice to the public sector. Downstream meaning at the very end of the policy. So once the policy's already been figured out, the government's already come up with the regulation, how can we work on some of the implementation of the work? And then upstream would be much higher up in the regulation practice, when the government is still exploring how this might work for their economic sectors, how it might work with other regulations. So examples of the upstream policy work would be the example I just shared that we're doing in Argentina, where the government is exploring how they might create a renewable energy certificate market. Downstream example would be something like what we're doing with Switzerland and Thailand, where Switzerland has already decided it wants to buy emission reductions from Thailand under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and now we're helping them make that happen. So there's a kind of close alignment with what the portfolio does, and there's a real feeling, at least from my side and also from Marco Maggini, that we need to try and work more closely between this practice and the portfolio side, so that the work we do on consultancy related to certificates can be carried over to the portfolio team and vice versa. Other work that we're doing is on REDD+. So we, of course, have the forestry team in Colombia, which is around consultancy-based project development, but we also do REDD+ policy advice and project advice. So we have a number of examples that we've done in the past on this. I'm not going to run you through them. Many of you have been working on them. And I think this is quite clear. But I think REDD+ actually is very interesting because we're going to see a lot of new opportunities in the pipeline with REDD+ going forward. Then we have work around the NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. This work we were doing a lot more in the past. Right now, the NDCs are now sort of going from formulation stage and towards implementation stage. And a lot of that work is related to mandates that multilateral development banks get, like World Bank, or even development agencies like GIZ. We also, of course, have in this practice work on MRV. That was a very strong part of South Pole's offering in the past when the consultancy unit was first being set up. So now MRV is still there, but I think the pipeline of work is probably not as active as it has been in recent years. And we're doing work, of course, on NAMAs. The one big NAMA assignment we're working on right now is, again, with the EBRD in Egypt. We're very close to getting the very first NAMA approved by the NAMA facility with the EBRD in Egypt. And right now, Yulia from our Bangkok office and Francisco are in Cairo trying to get this approved. So if we were to get this approved, it would be huge because it would be in the order of magnitude of several $1 million, and it would be a registered NAMA. And then, of course, any kind of consultancy we can do around the implementation of the Paris Agreement. That, I think, is quite vague, but really it's related to the bullet points above, but in synergies with the outcomes of the Paris Agreement. So any of the work that we take on in this practice, we need to make sure that the work we do somehow can be carried over or have a direct link to other business lines in the company. And so we're quite selective about what we do because we want to make sure that it is of value to other teams, particularly the portfolio team and the supply chains team. So yeah, that's kind of the sort of quick and dirty rundown of the practice. Really, it's around policy advice. So if you work with me, you get to be a policy geek, which sounds exciting for certain kinds of people, and other people, it's like, oh my God, get away from me. I don't want to do that at all. So if you like that kind of stuff, this is a good place to be on. Any questions? Okay, I'm not hearing any questions.
Charlie has a question.
Yeah, I just want to know, when you say we, like how many people have been involved with the mandates that you're implementing and proposals inside your practice? And are you like the only like full-time member, or you have like other members that are also full-time, or it's like maybe in Croc and Prof where we have some people that go from one practice to another sometimes?
Yes, good question. So right now, I'm the only person full-time working on this. And then the members of the CNS team who work on these types of assignments would be what I consider the quote-unquote we. So various people have worked on these assignments over the years. I can't tell you the approximate number. I think right now we've probably got between 10 and 15 people working on all these different mandates right now. And then, of course, on the proposal writing as well. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably the overall number. We are, however, hiring a senior consultant to join me, and he has recently accepted our offer. His name is Paul Salmon. He will be based in London with me. And he comes from a background of economic modeling and economic analysis related to carbon pricing and climate policy. So he is very experienced in this type of area, and he would be the other person working on this type of work. So he would be sort of our senior consultant in this practice, which is similar to other practices like on supply chains or on climate finance. Yeah.
That's the position that was advertised as engagement manager for carbon markets.
Yeah.
So he has finally accepted.
He has. It was quite a while, but he finally said yes. So we're really looking forward to him starting later this year.
Very good. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? No?
Okay, cool. So got 15 minutes left, and I just thought it would be good to give you a little theory around carbon pricing. And these are some of the slides that I gave in the global learning session last week. So a lot of times people ask me, well, what's the difference between a carbon market and a carbon tax? Or why is a market better than a tax? And I've been getting this question a lot from CAMs as well. And I just thought it would be good to go over some of the theory of this area with you, especially because you are all working in Latin America. And Latin America is going through a renaissance, if you will, right now, with the exploration of applying a carbon price. So let's start with carbon market theory. The most important element, I think, related to putting in place a carbon market is that it sets a cap on pollution. The government creates what we would consider a budget for how much emissions it wants to allow. And if you set that budget, then you have a cap. And if you go above the cap, then you have to pay. And you have to pay for this in the form of a pollution permit. Oftentimes, these are called allowances in cap and trade or carbon markets. And unlike carbon tax, where there is no cap, there are legal limits with the cap. So the government every year has to make sure that the cap isn't exceeded. They need to continue to make sure that the cap doesn't grow. And in certain jurisdictions, like in Europe, the cap actually declines every year. So every year in Europe, our cap gets tighter by around 1.75%. And after 2020, the cap will get tighter by more than 2.2%. So every year, the amount of pollution that is allowed to be emitted into the atmosphere tightens, okay? And that is really what is, I think, one of the most important parts of a carbon market and a really persuasive argument around this. It also usually is a market-based system. So the theory behind this is that the market sets the price, and therefore the market will determine what is the overall price of emissions reductions. And the market will perform in the most cost-effective way. And it'll respond to macroeconomic fluctuations. So when emissions go up because the economy goes up, then the price will go up as well because companies are producing more emissions and therefore they'll have a stronger demand for those emissions reductions. Now, those of you who might know a bit around carbon markets know that it hasn't really worked out that way, especially in Europe, where our economy crashed in 2013 and 14, and the price of emissions allowances also crashed. And that's because in Europe, the design of the EU ETS, the EU emissions trading system, was such that the system produced as many emissions as they assumed would be in previous economic forecasts. So there was an assumption that that the European economy would grow and therefore that emissions would grow. And that assumption was obviously flawed. It addresses industry competitiveness. So if you are a heavily trade exposed company, maybe you trade a lot of fuel or you trade a lot of strategic exports to your economy, for example, steel or I don't know, metals. You can be exempted. You could lobby the government to exempt you from this, and therefore you don't have to pay for those permits. Obviously, environmental groups hate that, but it's one way that governments and policymakers can address trade-exposed entities. And the idea over time is that you have many carbon markets that can eventually link up with each other and correspond with each other, so that you have a more global carbon market, which would be more effective at dealing with the global problem of climate change. And we're starting to see the first links emerge, especially in North America, between California and Quebec, and also here in Europe, Switzerland and the EU emissions trading system will be linked from next year onwards. So let me go through carbon taxes, and then I try and answer any of your questions. And I hope this is still interesting. I wasn't trying to be professorial here. I just think it's interesting because when we talk about carbon pricing, it's really important to know sometimes the background and get back to basics. So carbon taxes are much easier to implement than carbon markets. So government can just quickly adopt carbon tax legislation and define what would be the price of the carbon tax, and therefore you know what is going to be the price of carbon in your economy. So in Colombia, they adopted the carbon tax very quickly at the end of 2016, and they set the price at $5 a ton. And so on January 1st, 2017, everybody woke up and said, okay, now it costs me $5 to pollute if I am a fuel importer or user in Colombia. The carbon tax idea follows the polluter pays principle. So if you pollute, you have to pay. And that is very attractive for a lot of economists and policymakers. It's very simple and elegant in their view. You can combine it with carbon offsets, and we know very well how that works in Colombia. And it's a proven policy choice in a number of different jurisdictions. And it is becoming more attractive in Latin America. Now, interestingly, in Latin America, we have carbon taxes in Colombia and in Chile. Argentina is currently studying a carbon tax. You also have a carbon tax in Mexico. But if you look at all of those countries which have the carbon tax, the only government who can actually say that they have emissions that are declining is that, as a result of the carbon tax, is that of Colombia. Why? Because in Colombia, they've combined the carbon tax with offsets. So as we know very well with the offset market, you have verified emissions reductions, you have a total number of reductions that have gone down. And so the government of Colombia can say, well, look how many reductions I've achieved with my carbon tax with offsets. Versus in a place like Chile, the government can't necessarily have the same evidence base of how much emissions have gone down, because in Chile, it's just a pure tax. If you emit, you have to pay the tax. So while Chile knows where the emissions are and they know who needs to pay for them, they can't assess if those emissions have actually gone down as a result of that tax. The flip side of that argument is in Colombia, the government might not be receiving as much revenue from the tax because every emitter in Colombia is buying offsets because they're cheaper than paying for the tax. So it's a bit of a trade-off when you combine offsets with a carbon tax. Any questions on the theory behind this carbon pricing concept?
Just a comment, Jeff.
Yes.
Argentina's carbon tax is already in place.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of, I know you said Argentina, but I didn't get the rest, sorry.
Argentina's carbon tax is already working. It's already in place.
Yes.
Did you get
Yes.
that?
Yes, I did. And just this year, they came out with the carbon tax.
Yes.
I had a question actually on the carbon market. You mentioned it as a negative point that during the crash of the European economy, the carbon price went down. But isn't that necessary to kind of relieve a bit industries that are struggling? I mean, if the price of carbon stayed up, I just don't see how that's so much of a negative.
Yeah, you can definitely argue that it helped those companies who, were having to shut down operations and let people go from their jobs. If the carbon price was low, then it was one less regulation that the companies had to face in terms of being a regulation that was very difficult for them to comply with. But the logic and the theory behind the carbon market is that irrespective of if the economy goes up or if the economy goes down, you still always have to pay for your pollution. And there's a cap on the total amount of emissions that you can produce. So if the economy goes down and your emissions go down, then therefore you don't have to pay as much for your pollution. And if the economy goes up and the emissions are growing, then you'll have to pay more for those. And we see that actually right now. Many people don't realize that, but in Europe, our emissions have gone up, and we actually might not meet our 2020 target anymore because of the turnaround in the European economy. And that's also a result of what's happening in the carbon market in Europe. A year ago, carbon prices were around 5 to 6 euros a ton. Now they have increased also because of the reforms to the European carbon market, and the price is closer to 14 euros per ton. So they've increased by more than 100%. And so for some companies, especially big companies, they can sort of hedge that issue, and they can buy the permits earlier on in order to avoid sudden price spikes. But for smaller companies who only need to engage in the market a few times a year, they don't like it at all, because they bought prices when they were low, and then the next year they buy them when they're high, and they don't like that. And so there's quite a lot of lobbying going on about how to exempt some of these small companies.
I have another question. So you mentioned like the two main drivers for the price of carbon would be then economic growth and the number of allowances, or like where you put the threshold for the cap. But are there other drivers that make fluctuations on the market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest driver, especially in more established carbon markets like in Europe and in California, is where the overall energy mix is going. So when the price of oil and gas and coal goes up, then usually carbon had also correspondingly gone up. So there was a correlation between the two. So when there's more demand for energy, then there will be more demand for emissions allowances under a carbon market. And that was one of the biggest drivers in the European carbon market until the economic crash. The other driver really is on what traders would say, how the overall sentiment in the economy and political economy is. So here's another fun fact for you. When President Macron was elected president in France last May, the weekend before, the Friday before the election, I think the election was on a Sunday, prices in carbon were around 5 euros or so in the European carbon market. On Monday, on the first day of trading, they started going up. And so did the broader basket of energy commodities, because speculators and traders in Europe had renewed confidence in the EU. You remember who Macron was up against. He was up against somebody who absolutely did not believe in Europe and wanted to retreat from Europe. So anytime you have a political election in Europe, or you have a big summit where Angela Merkel and Macron and other leaders get together and pass a broad policy basket of measures to support the European economy, the price goes up. And we saw that also with Brexit. When Brexit happened, the market for emissions allowances went down quite a lot, because a lot of traders didn't know whether or not the emissions allowances that UK companies hold would be able to be used in the future if the UK were to also leave the European carbon market. So these political issues have also a big effect in at least the European market. And the same is true in California. Other parts of the world, and if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you here this map, where there are other carbon pricing systems, and we just don't see that same level of volatility in carbon prices and activity as well. But for the company as a whole, for South Pole as a whole, when you look at this map, the biggest carbon markets by volume in terms of trading are in Europe and in California. But for our company, the biggest markets for compliance are in Colombia and in Australia. So for us as a company, we are really well positioned to sort of work in these countries that aren't necessarily the flashiest or most interesting stories around carbon markets, but we take a position early on and we're able to leverage that position to capture a lot of market share like we've done in Colombia and Australia. But if you look at this map as a whole, the countries in dark shaded blue are where you have emissions trading systems. The ones in orange are where you have carbon taxes with offsets. And then in green are countries that are looking at setting up some form of a carbon market. And so the work we're doing in Thailand, for example, with the World Bank Partnership for Market Readiness is related to Thailand's interest in setting up a market. We also have done and are planning on doing work in Vietnam with our colleague Medea, who will start working on supporting the Vietnamese government to work on their carbon market. So there is movement happening in the world today around carbon pricing. Just if you look at the map alone. So we're at the end of the half an hour. I could keep talking, but I know you guys have a lot more to discuss. So I'll just make sure you have these slides and you can go through them in your own time if you want to learn more.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I have many questions. But can you listen to me, Jeff?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I only have one major question. I think that we're all foreseeing a huge oversupply of allowances coming up in the European Union in the coming years. How do you see the market stability reserve role evolving in the future? I know that this could be kind of an artificial way of controlling the oversupply, but it's also boosted by this European 2020 policy. And many other policies at national level in different countries in the union. So how important do you think this market stability reserve role is in the coming years for the whole zone?
Yeah, wow, great question. So it's a really important policy because the market stability reserve serves kind of like the function of a central bank. So when there's too many allowances in the market, the market stability reserve will go in and buy them up, right? And when there's too much demand for allowances and not enough supply, the market stability reserve will unleash allowances. So I think it's incredibly important to providing stability in the EU emissions trading system. And other countries that are looking at putting in place these kinds of policies will likely study this very closely because it's sort of an additional policy element that legitimizes the market and makes it something more robust and makes it something more mature. So I think it'll be very important. And the other really important discussion in Europe is around increasing the European 2030 target. And this is very important for our company because if Europe increases its 2030 target, it will likely do so by buying emissions reductions from other countries under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And that would be a tremendously positive outcome for South Pole, because then we could position ourselves as a player to provide emissions reductions from our projects or from other projects and activities from our portfolio from other countries. So I think in Europe, the introduction of this market stability reserve is very interesting because it helps make the market more mature and stable, and also legitimizes carbon markets as a very strong policy tool. And so other countries will look at that and have renewed confidence in putting in place a carbon market, which will indirectly help our business in terms of providing advice on carbon markets, because more countries will want that advice. And then, of course, in Europe, with this conversation that is slowly starting now about increasing the 2030 target. You saw that just a few weeks ago. There was a new European Environment Council in Spain and Portugal and Italy and France and even all the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Denmark said, hey, we want to take a higher target than 2030. And so this is happening. This is really exciting. And if it does happen, then there might be an opportunity that Europe would need emissions reductions through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I think there's a presumption that Europe will sooner or later make that decision. And that would be a tremendously positive decision for South Pole.
Hey, Jeff.
Hi.
This is Pablo here. I have a question regarding what you said of about the opportunity for South Pole, because one of the questions that I have relates to the majority of South Pole's portfolio is in the voluntary market, and for this to become an ITMO, an internationally tradable, I don't remember.
Mitigation.
Mitigation outcome. It would have to be sort of nested into the country's accounting. So, and this triggers a lot of questions about how this process will happen, how the fungibility will look like between countries and all this stuff. Yeah. So, what is your view on this?
My view is that it's too early. The negotiations on Article 6 are still ongoing at the UNFCCC. So that issue is really open. And I think it's too early to really have a view. I think for many of the countries who are going to buy emissions reductions through Article 6 in the future, they will need to make sure that the emissions reductions they buy from another country are not counted twice. So if I buy emissions reductions from you, Pablo, then I get, say I buy 100 from you, I get them, but you need to make sure that you don't subtract 100. Just because I got them, that doesn't mean that you then can also subtract 100. And so this issue around accounting is really the most important issue on Article 6 right now. And they're trying to deal with this issue before they deal with what type of emissions reductions will be used, whether they're from the voluntary carbon market or from the compliance carbon market. Now, I think for South Pole, we're extremely opportunistic, right? So if we can sell our credits in the voluntary carbon market at a higher price than we could sell them under compliance, then we'll go for the voluntary market, always. But that's so early days that I really couldn't describe it in more detail than just that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yes, I agree, actually.
So I didn't talk around REDD+ or the work we're doing on NOMAs in this presentation. I'm sorry for that. I just wanted to sort of explain you in big picture what we're doing and then give you a little bit of flavor around carbon markets and pricing. But you know, if it's something that you think would be worth doing in the future and talking through more around what we're doing in this particular practice, which I must say seems to be getting a little bit bigger by the day in terms of things we're working on. It's becoming a bit of a bubble. I'm happy to give another presentation on a future call.
I think, Jeff, that would be interesting if you could share with the team how you're working closely now with Marco, Victor, and how we want to get back into the REDD+ sphere that we had left aside a bit over the last month.
Yeah, so what we did recently is, you said REDD+, is that right, Sarah?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so we created a REDD+ sort of strategy group. Myself, Victor, Bamshad, and Marco are in this group, and we don't meet that regular. We've only met twice. But the idea with this group is that we figure out as a company what we want to do on REDD+. So do we want to do more policy advice? Do we want to develop more projects like we've done with Cariba and Mataven? Or do we want to do something different, like creating a REDD+ fund, for example? Well, we met twice, and then Reynat found out about this group and was super enthusiastic about it and said, I want to be on the next call, and you shouldn't just do REDD+, you should do everything related to carbon markets. We should have more strategy. And so that's something we're going to try and do more is, how can we be more strategic about the consultancy work we're doing around carbon pricing, and then what we do in the portfolio team. So the insights we learned from, example, working with Switzerland, or if we're successful on a proposal that Anna and I are working on with Sweden, these kinds of lessons we learn working with governments on Article 6 and carbon markets, we can sort of use them in our offering in our portfolio team and use some of the insights we gain to develop new projects or new assignments in our projects team. That's the kind of logic, is that we have a better synergy between our work in the CNS team on these issues, and then the work and appetite for taking on more projects and doing more origination happens in the projects team, that there's more of a crossover. Right now, you know, there isn't very much of a crossover, and we have to figure out how we can be better at doing that. And that's a challenge for me and for other people in the company, but I think it would be really beneficial for people in both teams, because you can work on a little bit of both things potentially in the future. But, you know, the real message is we're in a transition time. We're leaving the Kyoto era of the CDM and voluntary markets, and now we're going into this Paris Agreement era where everything is going to be a little bit different. And so during that transition time, we need to figure out as a company how we best resource ourselves for the post-2020 period for carbon markets.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I think there are no more comments in Mexico. So yeah, well, Jeff, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. It would be great if you could share your slides with us.
Yeah.
And
I was gonna say,
maybe we could have another session to continue on this topic.
Yeah, sounds good. I hope it was useful and I didn't bore you. And happy to have another chat in the future. And thanks for inviting me.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice one.